Hi, and welcome to the Improvisors podcast. I'm Kevin Janes, and this is my co-host, Neil Thomas.
Thank you, Kevin. On the Improvisers podcast, we talk with performers about their histories, their practices, their conceptualizations around their practices, and their aspirations. Who are we in conversation with today, Kevin?
Today, Neil, we've got the wonderful opportunity to chat to HILARY ELLIOT. HILARY is a performer, director, teacher, author,
and a self-described recovering academic.
Great. Let's go.
Welcome, HILARY ELLIOT, to the Improvisers podcast. We are thoroughly excited and thrilled to have you on board, and we're glad that your internet connection is still working, HILARY.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, it is currently working, and so we're hoping it'll stay working for a little bit. Yes, absolute delight to be here. It's a beautiful, sunny, just have to say, sunny Yorkshire morning.
Brilliant. Maybe we can start today's conversation with the beginnings of HILARY ELLIOT in performance. When did it start? How did it start? Why did it start?
Why did it start? Well, performance-wise, I actually had what I think of now, looking back, as a very conservative background. I studied ballet intensely as a child from the age of 5 to 17 in Canberra, which is where I grew up. And it was a very, very intense education up to what at the time was considered a kind of pre-professional level. So I got to age 17 and thought, am I going to try and become a professional ballerina, or am I going to go to university? And I came from a very academic background, so a very conservative education in that way as well. My father was a professor. And so I went to university, but I kept kind of dancing, and I also got involved in amateur theatrics. I would join the local university Shakespeare club and did plays and things like that. But I was very much pursuing kind of an academic career whilst doing those other kind of artistic forms as well. But it was all very, very conservative. I went to ANU. There was really a lot of just learning about form, a lot about tradition, certainly no experimentation, very kind of orthodox productions that I was involved in. Then I went over came over here to England, and did a master's in theatre studies, where I discovered for the first time this form called physical theatre. And looking back, I just think, how could I have not have heard of the term physical theatre? But I did come over here in 1992 to start with. And suddenly a lot of what I'd been interested in, which was form, the kind of structures of words and the structures of movements, were coming together in what at the time, the early kind of 90s into the 2000s in England, was this burgeoning scene of small physical theatre or dance theatre or total theatre companies just, playing with words, playing with movement. And so after I got my master's, I got involved in that, and I was creating little kind of shows with people, and I was also teaching that. And it was really the form that I was really excited by, what happens when words and movement kind of work together. I saw a phenomenal physical theatre company at the time called Volcano, who did Shakespeare's sonnets in physical theatre form. And it was one of those, seminal moments as an audience member, where you're sitting and you have literally never seen anything like it. I might still have been doing the MA at that point, and it just did that to me. I just went, what is this? I need to do this. This is so exciting. Shakespeare has never been like this. It's probably not meant to be like this, but it is fantastic. And so I sort of started on what really was a kind of career in physical theatre, dance theatre. I was teaching and I was making work. But it was all set. It was all in that world of creating pieces of work that are set. They're scripted, they're choreographed, they're performed, they're repeated. And that was the world that I knew. Then when I came back to Melbourne, I'd never been to Melbourne before, but I came back to Australia in 1997. I've got dual citizenship, by the way, which explains this bouncing back and forth. But I came to Melbourne, 1997, and was just beginning to meet people. And somebody said, you should come and see this this performance that's going on under the auspices of this man called Al Wunder. This was 1997 in Melbourne. And he does this thing called improvisation. And a bit like my big revelation with the term physical theatre and seeing an instance of physical theatre, I just went, what? Okay. So I went along. In retrospect, it must have been a Cubitt Street performance. I didn't know that at the time, but I think it must have been around then. It certainly wasn't Cecil Street. And I sat in the audience and I had a similar kind of experience to when I'd first seen something that was calling itself physical theatre. I knew it was improvised. I'd been told it was improvised. I had absolutely no idea how these people were doing this. I was just kind of stunned. I was in awe of them. I was a bit scared as an audience member. All my reference points for making work, for set work, were just like they were not there. And I was enthralled and I was intrigued and just came away going, I don't know what that was. And then someone said, you should start doing classes with Al Wunder. And I didn't for a while. I was too scared because my main response, my main emotional response to seeing that performance was, I could never do that. Whatever resources these performers, these practitioners are coming out, I could never do that because it's not set. How do they know what they're doing? You know, all of those very corny beginner questions. But then I did something took me to an Al class, and I think it was that. I think it was the fear took me and the immense curiosity about what is this thing called improvisation. Very much like Andrew, when he did his conversation with you, said he didn't know there was a thing called improvisation before he encountered Al. It was exactly the same with me. So I started doing classes. And then, of course, I got addicted and I just did more and more classes in the sort of about 98, 99, 2000, that kind of period. I did his extended workshops that he was doing at the time. And what happened to me with that was, certainly I worked through the fear. I was still delighted and enthralled by this combination of words and movement. And of course, in Al's teaching, that's a big part of his pedagogy and his way of encouraging students. You know, if you have a propensity for language, then out it comes. If you don't, then it won't. But I realized, of course, that I was playing with my old ballet technique and playing with sort of words in ways that I hadn't before, because it was all this open-ended teaching that he was doing. I mean, I remember, I write about it in the book, but I remember the first class and just coming away being completely lost. I mean, there Al was in the corner with his humdrum. I didn't know what a humdrum was. I'd never seen it. He was sort of in the corner. He barely said anything. That was one of the big things, you know. It was like he barely spoke. He just set up scores and we sort of did them. There was no feedback from him afterwards, which was an enormous thing as a novice student. It's like, well, aren't you going to tell me how terrible I was or what I need to improve? And you know, I came away just going, what? I have no idea what's just happened to me. But it was enough of an excitement and an enticement to keep going. And then so I studied with Al, and I would perform as well, as part of Al's kind of setup. A bit later on in my time in Melbourne, I joined Peter Trotman's classes. So Peter Noel and I would often do the Monday nights, and I, you know, loved that very idiosyncratic way of working with language that Peter has, and that was just very, very exciting. But at the same time, this period in Melbourne, which for me was about 1997 up to about 2004, when I came back here, I was also still creating little set pieces with the company at the time. We would perform at like Mama. It was that kind of size of show, and do little rural tours. So I still had improvisation alongside kind of set choreographic work, but the improvisation world was where I felt I was growing, where I was discovering, where I had this battle with this technique, because although I'd stopped ballet when I was 17, it's in the body forever when it's that intense, when the training is so intense. So I was working with and through all of that, and then, you know, discovering obviously everything to do with the way Al taught, and just kind of loving it. So that was all about the discovery, what I think of as a discovery phase. And I came back here for spurious personal reasons in 2004. I've been here ever since. So 20 years, at the end of this year, it'll be 20 years. And I fell into academe really very accidentally. It was it was a sort of functional thing. I realized that I couldn't afford to live freelance over here the way I had in Melbourne, where I'd been juggling performing, teaching at universities, teaching in schools, and could make, at that time, you know, a comfortable living in Melbourne. Couldn't do that here. And I fell into academe. I'd never thought about it. I applied for a job at a university called Edge Hill, which is in Ormskirk next to Liverpool. And it was a lecturer in physical theatre. And I got it, which was crazy. I did that for about 9 months, absolutely loved it, but I was taking on a terrible commute, which again, coming from Australia, was an awful shock to the system. And so I couldn't do that. And then I got a job at Huddersfield University straight after the Ormskirk one, which is where I then was for 16 years. So most of my time in England, so full-time academic. I was a senior lecturer. My title was dance, theatre and performance, or something silly. And again, I did lots of physical theatre productions. I did dance theatre. I taught sort of movement for them from a kind of when they were doing their straight acting. And what had then happened to my understanding of performance and my understanding of improvisation was, of necessity, it became something that I had to write about. It became something that, because you're in the academy, you couldn't just do it. I couldn't just do improvisation anymore. So what I had been living and enjoying in Melbourne, it just sort of stopped. You know, there's that silly academic phrase, you know, publish and be damned, or publish or die, or whatever it is. And it's an absolute truth. And I thought, well, if I'm going to have to write, I'm going to write about this form, which I've been exploring and loving. So I wrote a few articles and they got published, and that was lovely. And then I embarked on a PhD, because I was required to get a PhD as well. This is all whilst teaching full time. And I did that in solo improvisation and sort of generative approaches. And I wrote primarily about the use of vision as a generative approach. And it was something that I know had sparked from Al's work. And I knew it was like a power source, one of mine, that I would sort of see things and stuff would happen. And it became a very kind of generative thing for me. So I wrote a lot about that. But of course, doing a PhD is a very tense and lonely and slightly maddening experience. And then I also sort of fell accidentally into writing a book about Al, because the context that I was working in with improvisation was still, you need to research it, you need to share it within conferences, you need to find ways of articulating it. It needs to be conceptualized. It needs to be formulated. You need to find words to describe what you do, all of that sort of stuff. And I loved it, but I was doing it because that was my job and I needed to. But with the book on Al, there were a number of different reasons why it came into being. One, I thought, okay, now I have to write a book. I've got my PhD, I've got articles. The next thing I'm being pressured to do is write a book. What am I going to write a book on? It has to be Al. And I remembered at the end of his book that he put an invitation out to his readers and his students. And he said very clearly at the end of his book that he would love a follow-up to be some of his ex-students writing a little bit about what they have done with his teaching, how they've developed it, how they've transformed it, what they've done with it. And I always remembered that. And every now and then in my history and academia, I'd thought, that's such a great idea. And I don't think anyone's done it. And I would look into it and like, no one has. No one's done this. And that was the prime kind of genuine motivation. It's like, I want to get in touch with some of his other ex-students and see if they'd be willing to write about what they have done with his teaching, which, as we all know, was so seminal and so instrumental in the advancement of so many performance practices and careers in and around Melbourne. So there was that. And I also had become fascinated by Al's own teacher, Alwyn Nicolai, about whom I knew very, very little. He'd mentioned time, space, shape and motion in his classes occasionally, but I was just fascinated by that. And so I started delving into Alwyn Nicolai and just went, oh, this is so exciting. And my other reason for the book was that I thought, this is my chance. It's my one chance. I'm in academia. This is my one chance to bring somebody whose work is so worthy of being kind of out there in this context, putting it out there, because I have an academic job and because I can get in touch with publishers and I can try to persuade them to publish a book. So I knew it was a privilege And I thought it should be there. I mean, he's got an astonishing pedagogy. It needs to be out there in academia. So that was my other motivation for writing the book. So all these things came together. And I did that towards the end of what was going to become the end of my academic career, when I think I basically finally burned out with it all around the time of COVID, just before the book was finished, actually, and then published. But I'm very, very glad that I did all that. And I think thinking about then improvisation, one last little phase, which is a phase I'm in now, because I left full-time academe in 2020. I kept teaching part-time, a little bit at Huddersfield, and a little bit since then at other institutions like Lincoln University and the Leeds Conservatoire. And I've just started sharing Zoom practice with Andrew Morris, which is by his invitation, which is absolutely lovely. And so in a way, my journey has gone full circle, and it's back to a very, very simple kind of discovery, but this time about performance on Zoom. And what is that? And I'm still in a process of trying to shed all the conceptualizing, all the sort of inner analysis, all the front lobal thinking that just takes precedence when you're writing a PhD or writing a book, where you're the subject and the object of things, or nothing can just happen. It needs to be put under a microscope. And I'm still, 4 years on, I'm still sort of shedding that way of being when I'm improvising, and just going, what is it here now? And that's lovely. And there's a discovery in that as well. So I feel like I've gone full circle.
Hilary, I'm wondering if you just want to hold your book up for a moment. Great. I just put it, there's one line, and this is a bit, I guess this is harking back a little bit to the sort of academe phase, but you had written in your bio that in your research, you'd explored interdisciplinary intersections of philosophy and improvisation, and the intersection between movement and speech. And in the sort of lead up to chatting with you tonight, Neil and I were talking about sort of the entwinement of movement and speech, and how there's particularities with most improvisers who've come through Al's lineage of how they've found ways of combining movement and speech. And I'd love you just to muse a little bit on that, maybe from your own reflections in academe, as well as your own practice, and just acknowledging the sort of this entwinement and what it means to you now, or what it's coming to mean. Would you like to pick that up?
Yes, yeah, very much. Oh, look, because it's for me, it's all about the ways in which movement might spark a thought, and then a thought might become verbalized. And so there's this kind of non-verbal or non-spoken thing happening for me when I move or when I dance. I mean, I don't dance as fully as I did when I was practicing with Al in Cecil Street, but the process is still the same. I would be moving, and ideas emerge. It's like the movement state is a generative kind of tool, if you like, not intentionally, but it becomes that, or an emotion or an idea. And at the same time, yeah, very much with vision, just this kind of quirk of the way that I still practice is that I would see something and quite often have a kinesthetic response to what I'm seeing, whether it's out the window or in a studio, an audience member's expression or the curtain or something. And then it becomes about, am I going to verbalize? Am I actually going to speak out loud what it is that is going on here in terms of emotion or physical kind of feeling or mood or imagery that's occurred to me? And the more I kind of studied with Alan, developed a craft, which I think is still there, the more I realized that it was very much a choice. I could keep moving and allow the feelings or the images just to be in the body and express those non-verbally, or I could actually just start talking and seeing what might happen. So the starting point would be that movement would generate imagery and mood, which would in itself generate the option, if you like, to speak or not speak. And then the speaking, it just kind of comes out. I mean, I love the describing of things. So it might be simply describing what is happening sort of physically, or going into a kind of a story world, which is again something that I think I learnt a lot of from Peter Trotman, and then found ways of just going, this is a beautiful way of making something in the moment. So there's these impulses, and there's these amorphous ideas, and there's these images which might be quite mental. I'm going to try and turn them into words, and by the same token, then it might just come back to being non-verbal. So they were the sort of ways that I would always work, or discovered that I was able to work when I first sort of entered that world with Al. And it's still very much the case. I'm finding that I'm doing exactly the same on Zoom, which is very interesting. I don't know why performing on Zoom, I thought the whole form will change. No, it doesn't. But that way of just getting excited by how words and movements can rub against each other and kind of spark with one another, and maybe moving and talking at the same time, or maybe moving leads to talking, or talking leads to moving. I love all that. And I guess looking back, it does hark right back to this crazy discovery I made of the term physical theatre, where language could have kind of body and would be embodied, verbal language would be, and by the same token, movement could be kind of nuanced and subtle and convey things not with the same precision as words, but perhaps almost with the same precision as words at times. Yeah.
Oh, wow. So a lot of the questions, you've answered a lot of the questions that I had, which is so lovely.
Oh.
So I'll have to think up new ones.
What?
I was wondering, well, I think we've got a great opportunity because you're so incredibly well versed in both set work and improvised work. And my question is often, for myself and for others, is around audiences and the reception that audiences might have of work. And I wonder if maybe we could talk about the virtues of set work for an audience, and the virtues of improvised work for an audience, and the virtue of having a blend, or how they might blend.
How they might blend. Oh, that's fantastic. But of course, when I was in that sort of hub of improvisatory kind of excitement in Melbourne in those late 90s, early 2000s, when Cecil Street was just kind of exploding with activity, there'd be so much kind of action. Performing there as an improviser to an audience which would be 99.9% improvisers was always safe. It was always, warm. It was always convivial, whether it was part of Al's, kind of extending from Al's classes, or just another kind of event, because audiences understood, like, oh, I improvised, this is improvised, and there's a set of assumptions maybe that you take in with you as an audience member about this, like, I'm going to be open to whatever happens. And of course that isn't the case with set work. You might describe it as a hybrid form, or a sort of danced version of Shakespeare's sonnets or whatever it is, but audiences might not necessarily really know about the kind of parameters of that, or what is really going on in that work in terms of its values or its tropes. So I certainly have always found audiences for the set work that I've done to be much more critically kind of minded, not necessarily negative, but so you did that. Whereas somehow that wouldn't come up with improvisation, because, well, of course you might do that, because it's all about the possibilities and the unknown of what might emerge. And so you might be surprised at what emerges, but there can't be an edge of criticism about it because it emerged. Whereas to have made that decision beforehand as a director or a dramaturg or a choreographer somehow kind of incites a more critical mind, I think, from audience members, or they did that differently from how I would do it differently. So a whole kind of set of sort of ways of approaching and watching the work that I certainly never experienced either as an audience member or as a performer when I was improvising. But I do want to tell you about my probably favorite ever semi-improvised performance as part of the academic world, which was in America at a conference, an annual gathering of Maurice Merleau-Ponty experts. I discovered Merleau-Ponty's philosophy as part of my PhD. It was the kind of theoretical paradigm, if you like, through which I studied solo improvisation. And I don't know how it happened, but I sent off an application to semi-dance a paper at this conference, and I was accepted, which for starters just kind of blew my mind. And it ended up being one of my, I think actually no, the most wonderful, surreal performance I have ever done, because of course it was semi-performing. It was about Merleau-Ponty's work. He is known as the philosopher of the body, but I was performing in a vast hall in this university campus in front of philosophers, predominantly white, middle-aged, highly intelligent, very cerebral men, who would have the most obscure and abstruse and convoluted kind of conversations about Merleau-Ponty that I simply couldn't understand. And then suddenly in front of them, I'm talking and I'm dancing Merleau-Ponty, and I it was a wonderful experience. And one of the philosophers afterwards, they gave me a standing ovation, which was just made my life. Actually, I just went, thank you, this is so surreal. But one of the philosophers afterwards said, we all think we know Merleau-Ponty, and we're sitting here and we're talking about the body, and then suddenly there's this body in front of us dancing. And I said yes, because it had been absolutely revelatory for them as well to see how these ideas from the infamous philosopher of the body could actually be embodied, danced and spoken about. And so that was one of my favorite audiences ever, and certainly a thoroughly enjoyable kind of experience in the end, because it was so strange and so unusual.
Hilary, in some quarters, I think Merleau-Ponty was also known as the dancing philosopher. Apparently, yes. Yes. I think he loved tangoing or loved dancing.
Yes, that's right.
But I just want to take it a little bit further, partly Neil's question, but partly I'm always very interested in relationality to an audience, and especially to an audience that are improvisers, because there's a particular sort of confirmation and license that comes with that. And also the emergence of material as it's emerging for us. And I always think that material is emerging relationally to those that are witnessing, and to our own imagination, and to the content of our improvisation. So I'd love if you could talk a little bit about your sense of sort of emergence of material relationally, and the particularities of that context for you.
Yes, that right now is fascinating, because I'm a novice to Zoom. I mean, you guys were phenomenal when you performed on Zoom, and I suspect that a lot of the practitioners that you talk to are very Zoom practiced. I've never performed on Zoom before, so it's only by invitation and a kind of practice that I'm beginning to discover that. And of course, there is no audience in the sense that one is feeding off a live audience who grunt or smile or laugh or cough or drink their coffee or something. And I've always had a very, very strong kind of visceral reaction to and responsiveness to the liveness of audience. And when I was in academia, all my productions were very much about, this is live, this is now, this is your audience. There'll be little things that will shift, tiny things that will shift because of the nature of this particular group of people who are watching you. So go with that, give them something. It's real, it's now. Give them a really wonderful experience. And of course on Zoom you don't have any of that. So that is the first thing that I'm beginning to come to terms to. I resisted it for years. It's why I've done no Zoom performing. It's like, I don't want that. I want the liveness. I want the studio. I want a group of people and the performer. For me, it's Peter Brook. That's what theatre is. A person walking across a stage, somebody's watching. There you have a piece of performance, a piece of theatre. And so I've resisted it for ages, but now I'm finding ways of playing with the zoomness of it, and the responsiveness has got kind of very little to do with what is on that screen or who is on that screen, and it is much more about the stimuli, I guess, that I'm getting from, like in this case, just the room that I am in, or certainly with me, there's a lot of content that is coming out about the current situation in England, because I've been Zooming every week, and the situation in England changes every week in terms of societal disintegration, really. And it's impossible, in fact, for me to stay away from that as a kind of a content, however it emerges through speaking or moving, but it's there. So it's like the sort of immediate responsiveness and kind of we are telling stories together, and this being a communal act, that aspect of performing has virtually gone with Zoom, but in terms of doing, not in terms of watching, but in terms of doing. But then the other things, the wider kind of socio-political context in which I'm living now, or what's going on in this room, or what's going on outside in my garden, again, there's an awareness, there's a responsiveness. I'm still very much responding to something, very much just go, what is here, what is now, and what can I make, or what am I making with what is happening right now? It's such a journey, though, to sort of take away the foundational, which is the audience, the live presence of the audience. Yeah.
Harkening back to your book,
Yeah.
Towards the end, there's a chapter or a section, and it's Beyond Wonder. And I was wondering if you could talk about that for you. What has been beyond wonder? And you know, we were talking before, we would love the idea of what's beyond now. Where are you thinking improvisation might go for you, or for others, for improvisers?
Yeah. Beyond wonder, it's interesting, because I think at one point the publishers and I were throwing around the idea that the book could be called No Wonder. And I think which I still absolutely love, but I think in the end it was far too witty for a very kind of earnest and publication company, because it was that thing of, like, you know, there is no wonder in the academic kind of arsenal, the academic world, so I'm going to put him there. But beyond wonder, actually, for that chapter, was something that Al himself came up with, and it was this idea of the contributors kind of coming aboard, and I'm so grateful to those who did write little bits about their work and how they had transmogrified Al's work. I don't think, for me, there will ever be a beyond wonder, and this is partly because I adore lineage, and again, when I was an academic, I felt such a privilege to be able to go, this was my teacher. And also, in terms of Orwell Nicolai, this was his teacher, you know, and this was the era in which he was working. And my God, what they're doing in the 60s in New York, it sounded astonishing. And I could kind of just enter into that by researching that era. And I think very often, you know, extraordinary teachers are not kind of acknowledged through, even though their work might be literally embodied. I don't think Al is in that situation, because everybody who's studied with Al has said, I studied with Al. But I for me, they're always in there. So little kind of quirky ways of working with language, and I'll go, oh, that's Peter, or something that Andrew has said to me, oh, that's Andrew, and the whole improvisation career, oh, that's Al. So there'll never be a time where I am beyond that. But I think because I'm in this process of kind of shedding the over conceptualization that academia does to you, I think all of that just becomes much more tacit and much more subtle, and I'm not thinking about it all the time. Maybe after an improvisation, chatting with Andrew, I'll be thinking about it and going, oh yeah, that's a classic moment where Al would have said this about it, or this is, you know, in Al's language, in his pedagogy, I was doing this. But I don't think consciously about that anymore, and I'm not needing to illustrate it anymore, like you have to do when you're writing a PhD or writing a book. You have to show these concepts. All that has been stripped away. So for me, there's something about just stripping as much as possible away now as an improviser, and this is mirrored in real life as well in England, and going to that beautiful place of noticing the minutiae and discovering, rediscovering simplicity, whether that's of form or of communication on a screen with sort of flat faces. It's just sort of stripping away as much as possible. It's like I've done the overcomplicated, over complex thing, and I'm glad of that. And now just going, what is left, and what therefore is improvisation when I'm watching it or when I'm doing it. Certainly when I'm watching, it's still just surprise and delight. When I was listening to the story that you two were telling with Andrew, it was just absolutely delightful and warming. And I think as a creator as well, there's like, oh gosh, I'm so old, but I'm suddenly doing this, or gosh, I've actually said that about these words have come out, and I've surprised myself, and it's very immediate, and it's very now, and I love that. I love that. It feels almost like quite a private exploration, which again, after the academic public facing years, is a real treat. Real treat.
Hilary,
Yeah.
I think I was just about to ask you a question before you just answered the question, but I still want to ask it. In part, there's something about yes, why improvisation? What is it that keeps you committed to the process? What is it that's sort of potentially life enhancing, and what is it about improvisation and living that either fascinates or enthuses or provokes or invites for you?
That's a wonderful question. Absolutely beautiful. I think like a lot of your improvisers that you've been speaking to, I improvise my way through my days, because I'm a retired academic now, recovering academic. And so I don't have set structures to my life anymore, which is fantastically freeing. And so I improvise my way through the garden, if you like. I've been spending a few years building up what I think of as a nature garden here, which feels incredibly important to me. Obviously, environmentally, ecologically, it really chimes with the values of kind of sustaining and maintaining the natural world, which had never really, it'd been a separate kind of aspect of my life from improvisation. And now I feel that they're entwined. I'll just go out into the garden and I'll just be there for hours, kind of with the earth, or, you know, feeding the birds. We've got a visiting ring-necked parakeet at the moment called Percy. I've decided to call him Percy. He's been visiting for about a month. And I spend a long time watching Percy. So those very, very sort of fundamental attitudes, if you like, of improvisation, about watching and silencing and noticing and being in the moment, I do constantly in my daily life, particularly outside, and I'm very aware of that. And in terms of more kind of formal practice, it's I think it's similar to when I started studying with Al, because I was scared, and I think I've started kind of practicing on Zoom because I hated it. And I was just absolutely hate Zoom. And so therefore, this is a great opportunity to kind of recalibrate that relationship. If this is what is open to me at the moment, if this is what is available as an improviser, I don't have a regular studio to go to. I used to do all my work in the studios at the Huddersfield University, and I could still go over there, but I'd rather sort of stay here. And so it's like this kind of perverse sort of stepping stepping stone that got me into that. And now it's a fascination. It's like, what are the possibilities? I know what they are as an audience member. It's so ironic because I love the Zoom performances I've seen, but I've still had this loathing of doing it. And so what are the ways in which I can kind of unpick that? And also in terms of content, we were talking earlier about content. England is such an unstable and unsafe place to be living these days. Physically unsafe, obviously, for vast swathes of the population, but also just in terms of, sort of mentally and what the living in this country does to one, that there's something about the content that is emerging for me when I'm improvising now that is processing that, I guess, and turning it into a story or turning it into a little moment of here's something. I'm still crafting it. So I don't think it's very therapeutic and cathartic. So I'm still very aware that I want to make something of that. And I think that's where the appeal is now in terms of making tiny little snippets of improvisation. It's like, we're all very lost over here. We're all quite damaged in some ways. And what can I do with that context to kind of ground myself a little bit? And so I think that's going on as well in terms of what I'm working on with Zoom.
Brilliant. We're unfortunately we're running out of time, Hilary. But I feel like it's been such a wonderful representation of you and your world. We could go on for another couple of hours and we wouldn't reach the end of it, but we do have to bring it there to a stop. And just out of the blue, I'm going to throw in a question, Kevin. And as the wild man that I am, it just suddenly occurred to me, I want to ask Hilary. I had never asked a guest this question before. It's a big thing. One of your favorite novels. I'd be interested to know.
Oh, goodness gracious. She says, looking behind.
Yeah.
At all the novels, one of them. Do you know, I've just finished Maggie O'Farrell. You know her?
I don't. Wow.
She's written all sorts of wonderful pieces of work. That's a great question. If you're going to ask me why it's one of my favorite novels,
yeah,
I might struggle a bit.
Hilary, we were Neil and I had been considering doing a podcast series on reading and writing. So maybe that's where that's going, Neil.
yeah, maybe. And you've been the very first guest.
Breaking
down.
Well, I'm honored. It's a great idea, by the way. You should totally do that.
Great. Hilary, just reconfirming what Neil said, thank you so much for sharing tonight. It feels like we could do a series with you rather than just simply one. It feels like we could have gone down many sort of tangential or pulled threads and sort of gone into things in far greater detail. But what a delightful opportunity it's been to chat to you and to sort of feel the freshness of your life around improvisation and the energization that sits there for you. It really is remarkable. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I'm very touched by that. Thank you so much. It's been fantastic. I've loved seeing you, those flat faces.
Great. Thank you, Hilary.
Thank you.